Welcome to another series of Lunch and Learn series. This one is on EPCRA CERCLA release reporting. This area ever kind of confuses you, hopefully this will straighten you out a little bit. If you have any other questions or comments at the end, by all means, give me a shout. I'd be happy to follow up with you individually. So let's get right into it. I am going to share my screen. Again, my name is John Wigger. I am with Cadenza Environmental and out of the Chicagoland area, and many years of experience in this area. So the first thing I wanted to do is talk about why you would even do this. So there are laws that were created that require reporting of emergencies involving the release of hazardous substances for the purposes of informing the community of the hazards. Enforcement can be severe for failure to do this kind of reporting. So just know that. So this is a refresher of the federal rules. You very well may have state and other local rules that apply. So make sure you look into those. It's fairly straightforward rules, but in practice it can and it does get quite tricky in some of the details and definitions, particularly with respect to some of the exclusions. I have a caveat in here as well. This is for training purposes. I am not an attorney, and if you are seeking legal advice, please consult a licensed attorney in your state. Know that what I'm conveying to you comes from my professional experience working in the U.S. oil and gas industry for many years. So the difference between CERCLA and EPCRA. CERCLA, Section 103, basically it addresses only CERCLA hazardous substances. I mean, I'll get into what these are, but note the word hazardous substances. Well, they must report releases that are into the environment of a reportable quantity or more, and you must notify the National Response Center. EPCRA is a bit more local, however. It addresses both CERCLA and hazardous substances and EPCRA extremely hazardous substances. So these things are things that could be potentially quite deadly in the environment and in the public and near a facility. This must report releases into the environment of an RQ or more with the potential for off-facility exposure. So if there's the possibility of exposure to it, that's where you would also call your State Emergency Response Commission, the CERC. I'll be saying that for most of the rest of this presentation, as well as your local emergency planning committees. That's the LEPCs. So the chemicals involved, releases into the environment of EPCRA, EHSs, extremely hazardous substances, or CERCLA, hazardous substances in a reportable quantity or more. So an RQ is set by US EPA through rulemaking. We'll get to that. And RQs are usually in units of pounds, either it's 1 or 10 or 100, 500, 1,000, even 5,000 pounds of the particular chemicals involved. Roughly, and these numbers change from year to year, but CERCLA hazardous substances, there's around 764-ish plus, including radionuclides and hazardous waste. There's also 356 or so EPCRA extremely hazardous substances. Both those categories exist, and there's around 130-ish that are on both lists. Again, these are approximate numbers. So where does this, I talk about a list, where does it exist? Well, US EPA publishes this list periodically. The last time it was August of 2020. It's changed by rulemaking. You can just Google it called the list of lists, but basically it's called the Consolidated List of Chemicals Subject to Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know, EPCRA. and CERCLA regs. And anyway, when you open it up, and it's a pretty thick document, it just has pages and pages and pages of chemicals and what the reportable quantities are under the different rule citations. So what does it mean, releases into the environment? Well, the environment means surface water, groundwater, drinking water supply, land, surface, subsurface strata, and or ambient air. It's pretty darn comprehensive. Releases into properly designed, constructed, and maintained containment structures, however, are not releases into the environment and are not reportable. So if you have a concrete diked area and you have a release into that, and that's all, and it doesn't go into water, groundwater, land, soil, whatever, then it would not be reportable. So, for example, containment structures that can be made of natural materials such as clay, engineered in such a way, so as long as it is effective in preventing the release from entering the environment. Here's a case where this is a concrete containment area with either painted or epoxy or something to that effect on it. So if there was a spill into this and it didn't go anywhere, it would not be a release to the environment. What's a reportable releases into the environment? Well, a release into a sewer that eventually leads to a river versus into a treatment facility. A release into a containment device that failed, or these are things that would be a release into a containment device that fails to contain the substance, or concrete pads that have cracks and gravel, or pipe alleys that fails to contain the material and contributes to soil and groundwater contamination, for example. Those would be releases. The definition of a facility under both CERCLA and EPCRA define the facility slightly differently, but for the purposes of this presentation, it doesn't usually matter. A facility means a petrochemical, manufacturing, transportation facilities and plants, basically just about anything where you have these chemicals in, outside of residential use. Releases from differing sources within the facility must be aggregated under both CERCLA and EPCRA. I'll get into that later in here, but you actually have to, if you've got places where you have maybe multiple releases going on, even though they're small, you still have to aggregate them to understand what your overall release to the environment is. The other thing about is the potential to migrate off-site. Under CERCLA, CERCLA defines a reportable release as any release of an RQ or more of a hazardous substance into the environment, which includes all media, that's air, land, and water. However, EPCRA defines a reportable release as any release of an RQ or more of a CERCLA hazardous substance or an EPCRA extremely hazardous substance, EHS, into the environment with the potential for exposure to persons off-site. That's a big deal there. It's the potential for exposure off-site, which actually helps define the two. EPA broadly interprets the phrase potential for exposure to persons off-site. They interpret it quite broadly. An RQ does not have to migrate off-site. An RQ must have entered the environment. A minuscule amount may migrate beyond the facility boundary. So releases to air, surface water, groundwater have the potential for exposure to persons off-site. Again, broadly interpreted by EPA in that way. Any spills of volatile materials, so it volatilizes to the air, it can be carried away. That does represent an exposure, potential for exposure to persons off-site. So assume all releases have the potential to migrate off-site, unless you have very good evidence to the contrary. For example, maybe a spill of non-volatile material that is immediately cleaned up, and the spill is in a containment area. Maybe that doesn't have the potential for exposure off-site. You may want to seek legal advice on situations like that. So the notifications under CERCLA Section 103 versus EPCRA Section 304. I have a nice slide here, and you can refer back to it later. But chemicals covered under both. Under CERCLA, it's just CERCLA, and the releases covered any release of the RQ into the environment. And notification requirements, you have to call the NRC, the National Response Center, for CERCLA. Now for EPCRA, it's both CERCLA hazardous substances as well as EPCRA extremely hazardous substances. Any release into of the reportable quantity into the environment with the potential for exposure to persons off-site. And you also have to call the LEPCs and the CERCs. And of course, if it's a CERCLA hazardous substance and you exceeded the RQ, you would also, of course, have to call the NRC. So there's some applicable exemptions, and I'll get into some of these a little bit, but not in a whole lot of depth. Each one can require a significant amount of study if you think it might apply. There's a thing called the petroleum exclusion under CERCLA, and then also federally permitted releases. So under the petroleum exclusion, releases of hazardous substances that are in petroleum, and the word petroleum is not defined, though there are some broad interpretations of what that means. But for example, benzene, xylene, and other chemicals that you can find in petroleum are exempt from the CERCLA reportable quantity reporting, but only when they are associated with a petroleum. So regardless of whether the release is air, land, or water, hazardous substance constituents of petroleum are exempt from CERCLA RQ reporting. Those same releases, however, may be subject to state regulations or Clean Water Act or OPA, Oil Pollution Act. So just because it's maybe exempt from CERCLA, still may be applicable under other regs. So know that if you have a bit of an oil spill or something like that, creates sheen, in most search situations, those are certainly reportable under the Clean Water Act. So also major components of gasoline, benzene, toluene, again, as I had mentioned earlier, are CERCLA hazardous substances, but are not EPCRA extremely hazardous substances. The petroleum exclusion means that the components of petroleum, although hazardous substances, are not reportable under CERCLA when they are released as constituents of petroleum. So, the same release would not be reportable under EPCRA because they are not extremely hazardous substances and are not reportable under CERCLA. So there's some nuances here, but if it's benzene, even in a reportable quantity under CERCLA, if it's associated or spilled because it's a component of gasoline, it would not be required to be reported under CERCLA. But there are some other cases. When is a petroleum constituent like xylene, a chemical, for example, xylene, a chemical feedstock, and no longer eligible for the petroleum exclusion? Well, it's difficult to draw a bright line to identify when the mixture ceases to be petroleum. EPA considers petroleum exclusion to apply to substances that a reasonable person would call petroleum. So a reasonable person would likely conclude that a highly concentrated xylene mixture was no longer a natural constituent of petroleum, but instead was a chemical feedstock. If you really need to get into the nuances of this, of course, I'd recommend getting some legal advice on that, but just know that there are some nuances of how to interpret what petroleum exclusion is, and a good bit of history of that. But again, these are not reportable under CERCLA. hazardous substance constituents of unburned fractions of petroleum emitted from a flare, because they are part of petroleum. MTBE, methanol, butanols, as a component of gasoline, are not reportable. But I'll go into some cases where they may be. So reportable under CERCLA, hazardous substance constituents that are derived from petroleum, such as neat solvents, toluene used as solvent, xylenes, even benzene, these would be reportable under CERCLA. Releases of MTBE, methanol, butanols, and other from a storage tank before mixing with petroleum, because at that point it's not petroleum anymore, it's some kind of feedstock additive or something. Those would be reportable, of course, if you exceeded the reportable quantity of those and you released them. So releases of extremely hazardous substances under EPCRA in petroleum are not exempt from EPCRA reporting. So petroleum releases that result in a reportable quantity or more of an extremely hazardous substance released into the environment must be reported to the CERCs and the LEPCs. Most constituents of petroleum are not extremely hazardous substances, but there are a few. So however, sulfur dioxide, a reportable quantity of 500 pounds, and hydrogen sulfide, a reportable quantity of 100, are extremely hazardous substances, and they can be found in petroleum and crude oil, for example. So a flaring event that results in more than 500 pounds of SO2 or 100 pounds of hydrogen sulfide vent into the air would be reportable to CERCs and the LEPCs. So in a situation where you have I'll just give a quick example, an exercise here. If a refinery has a spill of 200 gallons of crude petroleum, is the release reportable under CERCLA or EPCRA? The answer is, well, it sort of depends. It depends upon what the quantities of each of the constituents are. Under CERCLA, it would not be reportable. It is petroleum. But if it did exceed 100 or 500 pounds of those other materials, extremely hazardous substances, it would be. In this case, 200 gallons of crude oil would not be. But what if a refinery has a spill of 10 gallons of benzene, intermediate additive consisting of 5% benzene with a density of around 7.5 gallons and an RQ of benzene of about 10 pounds? Is the release reportable? So federally permitted release exemption. We're moving into the other exemption. Releases in compliance with federal or state permits are exempt from CERCLA and EPCRA release reporting. So state permit must be issued under EPA delegated program. All permit limitations must be federally enforceable, and the permit or control regulation must act to control the release of the hazardous substance or the extremely hazardous substance. So if you're actually permitted to release more than that, then it is no longer reportable. And there are a few cases where that can be the case. So, but the releases that you do have must be in compliance with a federally enforceable permit limit. In most cases, lots of larger facilities, that happens to be the case because you are typically rolled into a Title V permit, which makes it federally enforceable. The reporting trigger would be a reportable quantity above the permitted level. So on federally permitted releases, air releases, state permits must be issued under regulations submitted for inclusion in the state implementation plan or other federal authority under the Clean Air Act. meaning it just the authority just has to come from the federal regs. The release must be in compliance with federally enforceable permit limit or control condition. Title V usually takes care of this at most facilities. Permit limit or control must be specific and must specifically limit or eliminate the release designated as hazardous substances or extremely hazardous substances. The permit or control regulations need not be stated in hourly or daily time periods, and the emissions can be controlled through either specific technologies or work practices. And the only requirement is that regulations limit or eliminate the release. Limits in consent decrees are typically considered federally permitted releases, that is, federal consent decrees. When a consent decree is closed, though, emissions are no longer federally permitted unless they are incorporated into the site's specific permits, which is actually fairly typical. Emissions in compliance with input BTU limits and others by permit are federally permitted releases. So the air releases from startup, shutdown, and malfunction, SSMPs. So startup and shutdown operations are treated in a variety of ways. Either of these two mechanisms could be sufficient for releases to be federally permitted if the provisions of the Act to limit or eliminate the released substances are federally enforceable. So approved startup, shutdown, and malfunction plans, for example, could qualify. And because startup and shutdown limits, direct limits are, excuse me, directly in the permit. So a facility's SSMP need not explicitly limit listed in the permit, so long as the facility is obligated to comply with the SSMP limits and that the obligation is federally enforceable. SSMPs need not be very detailed, so long as the requirements act to control or limit the hazardous substance released and are federally enforceable, as I had mentioned earlier. In general, provisions in a federally enforceable SSMP are sufficient to make releases during an orderly startup federally permitted. However, provisions in SSMP are related to incidents and accidents generally will not act as a shield. So if it doesn't go as the plan suggests. So now I want to get into the mixtures and reportable quantity mixture rules. So a release is reportable when a component of a hazardous substance or an extremely hazardous substance of a mixture or solution is released into the quantity equal to or greater than the reportable quantity of that particular component. So if a concentration of some of the components is not known, then we need to isolate the known substance and compare the quantities to the reportable quantity. So you compare quantity remaining to the lowest RQ in the mixture. So for example, 70 pounds of a mixture is released, which contains 3 substances, say A, B, and C. The reportable quantities for these substances are as listed: A, 100 pounds, B, 10, C, 100 pounds. The mixture contains 40% of substance A. So has there been a reportable release? Well, of course, 40% of 70 pounds is only 28 pounds of substance A, therefore it would not be a reportable quantity. However, if you don't know the amount of B and C together, the remaining 70 minus 28 pounds is more than 10 pounds, and therefore 10 pounds, there could be the
chance that compound B reportable quantity was exceeded, and therefore that should be reported. Another example of reportable quantity mixture rule for wastes: for unlisted hazardous wastes that exhibit characteristics of corrosivity, ignitability, the RQ applies to the entire waste. For unlisted wastes that are hazardous based on toxicity, reporting trigger is the RQ of the contaminant in which the characteristic is toxic. So the RQ applies to the waste itself, not merely to the toxic contaminant. So the reportable quantity, kind of a wrap up, a determination should be based on the best professional judgment and any readily available data. No additional monitoring is required to determine the quantity released. So estimate the release quantity, compare it to the reportable quantity, and make a quick decision. And if it's close, report it. You can retract any of these reports if you're not sure, but conservatively, it is advisable to go ahead and report. The consequences of not reporting are and can be pretty severe. So internal notifications, just and including delayed calculations, are not acceptable reason for delaying any kind of agency notification. That is, you can't say, well, or it's not advisable to wait until certain calculations are done. Many of these kinds of calculations could or maybe should be done ahead of time or estimated ahead of time in anticipation of some kind of accident. So responding to release is also not an acceptable reason for delaying agency notification. If different releases of the same substance occur from different structures, I had mentioned this earlier, or locations at the facility, those releases must be aggregated and compared to the reportable quantity. So that is, you could have a release over here and a release over here. Those are not two separate releases from the facility. It's one release from the facility, and the regulations require you to aggregate them. Also, reportable quantities are measured not over a specific incident, but over a rolling 24-hour period of time. That's also important to note. I had mentioned reporting and the timing of that. So the regulations require that you provide immediate notification. So must report immediately upon knowledge of reportable release. EPA views this as within 15 minutes. So knowledge means when anybody in the company has knowledge of a reportable release. It does not just mean when the environmental staff has the knowledge. So if a facility isn't staffed by environmental folks or even any environmental folks, it does not keep you from or give you an excuse not to call it in. Operations folks should be trained to know to call in, especially if you're dealing with a hazardous substance or an extremely hazardous substance in your firm. Should know of certain size releases must be called or reported. So if you do happen to come across a case where it must be reported, so the content of the initial notification would require the name and the location of the facility, the chemical name or identity, and whatever substance is extremely hazardous, an estimate of the quantity released, the time and duration of the release, media in which the release occurred, soil, groundwater, soil, air, both, all. known and anticipated health risks associated with what was released, advice regarding medical attention for anybody that may be exposed, health and safety precautions of responders and or people that are responding even at the facility, and facility contact person information. Once this is done, depending upon the size, this may happen easily, but a written follow-up notification to the CERCs and the LEPCs are also required. Follow up as soon as practicable, usually within 7 days, and provide updated release description, actions taken to respond to and control the release, and health and safety information. Some other advice here, would be that you document all notifications and release calculations internally. Document all that, make sure you have a good record of all of this. Ensure that written follow-up reports to the CERCs and LEPC are consistent with the calculations and documentation. Note the time when knowledge of the reportable event occurred, because the clock starts at that moment. Wanted to briefly discuss continuous releases. If a release is continuous and is stable in quantity, it can be considered a continuous release. And in some cases, that can keep somebody from having to report this on a continuous basis, but report it as a continuous release until such time it can be managed. So, the advantage is there's one call to the CERCs and the LEPC and not the NRC if it's not a hazardous substance. A written report 30 days later to the CERCLA, LEPC, and EPA region if it's a hazardous substance describing the release. A written report to EPA annually, and a notification to the NRC and the CERCLA, LEPC of a statistically significant increase. So continuous release must be re-evaluated as well on an annual basis and followed up with agencies. Documentation for this is important. It's important to document your calculations, the timeliness, when the release was discovered, when there was knowledge of the RQ that was exceeded, who was notified and when, completeness, and where appropriate notifications are notified. It's not a bad idea to actually have some of this documentation forms to fill out if you have something like this. It's not uncommon that if you have a form that requires you to fill all this out, that will help you keep a record of this for the future. So best practices when it comes to release reporting. It requires awareness of all the personnel on your facility, a rigorous process, documentation, and when in doubt, report. You can retract it, but you can't report something much later than it was required to be without potentially having some rather severe consequences. So with that, I'm going to stop my sharing, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed this brief Lunch and Learn seminar. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to give me a call or email me, and we could get into any specifics of that you have. Until next Lunch and Learn, thanks.